Harold and Margaret Hendricks were 73 and 71 years old, respectively, when they were beaten, robbed, and left to die in the woods outside Millbrook, Pennsylvania. They were found 31 hours later by a man they had walked past every Thursday for 2 years without once making eye contact. A man whose name they didn't know, a man they had, on more than one occasion, crossed the street to avoid. His name was Vincent, and when he found them in a ravine half a mile from the highway, Harold's left leg was broken in 2 places, and Margaret's lips were cracked and bleeding from dehydration, and neither of them expected to see another morning. What they didn't expect was that Vincent would carry Harold on his back for over a mile through dense forest in the dark, then return for Margaret, and then stay with them in the hospital for 6 days until their daughter arrived from Seattle, or that the man they had spent 2 years pretending didn't exist would become the most important person in the final chapter of their lives. Harold Hendricks grew up in Millbrook in a white 2-story house on Sycamore Avenue with black shutters and a wraparound porch his father had built in 1948. His father owned the hardware store on Main Street, the one with the creaking wood floors and the smell of sawdust and machine oil, the one where you could still buy nails by the pound from wooden bins, and where his father knew every customer by name and every customer's father before that. Harold learned to work the register when he was 9, learned to mix paint when he was 11. She learned to cut glass and thread pipe and speak to men twice his age with the particular respect required in a small town where your reputation was the only currency that mattered. He was an only child, a good student, a decent athlete, the kind of boy who said yes sir and no ma'am, and held doors and shoveled Mrs. Patterson's walk every winter without being asked. He met Margaret Stoltz at a church social when he was 17 and she was 15, a girl with dark hair she wore in a braid down her back and a laugh that sounded like wind chimes, and he knew within 10 minutes of talking to her that he would marry her, and he did 3 years later in the same church in front of 200 people on a Saturday in June when the air smelled like cut grass and honeysuckle. Margaret had grown up on a dairy farm 4 miles outside town, was the youngest of 5 children and the only girl, which meant she learned early how to hold her own, how to speak up, how to work as hard as any of her brothers and twice as hard to be taken seriously. Her father sold the farm when she was 16 after her oldest brother was killed in Vietnam, and the next oldest moved to Pittsburgh, and the remaining 2 made it clear they wanted nothing to do with cows or 4 a.m., milkings, or the kind of life that left your hands cracked and bleeding by the time you were 30. Her father took a job at the mill, and her mother took in sewing, and Margaret worked summers at the 5 and dime, saving every penny for a future that felt both inevitable and completely uncertain. Harold was that future. Harold was steady. Harold was the hardware store, the house on Sycamore Avenue. On the life that looked exactly like the life her parents had wanted before the farm, took everything and gave back only exhaustion. They married and moved into an apartment above the drugstore, then into a small house on Elm Street. Then, when Harold took over the hardware store after his father's heart attack, into the house on Sycamore Avenue, the one with the wraparound porch, the one Harold had grown up in, the one where they raised 2 children, Kenneth and Diane, in rooms that smelled like lemon polish and where every piece of furniture had a story and every story had a moral. They were not wealthy, but they were comfortable. They were not prominent, but they were respected. They went to church every Sunday, voted in every election, paid their taxes on time, kept their lawn mowed and their shutters painted and their gutters clear. They donated to the food bank every Thanksgiving and bought toys for the Christmas drive and wrote checks to the volunteer fire department. They were good people. They believed they were good people. They believed that goodness was a matter of showing up, following rules, maintaining appearances, being polite to the people who mattered, and invisible to the people who didn't. They had lived in Millbrook for over 50 years and had never once seriously questioned the architecture of their own decency. Vincent Cole grew up in Philadelphia, in a neighborhood where the row houses pressed against each other like teeth, and where the sound of sirens was so constant you stopped hearing it the way you stopped hearing your own heartbeat. His mother worked 2 jobs, one cleaning offices downtown and one stocking shelves at a grocery store. Young and his father had left before Vincent's 3rd birthday, a man who existed only as a name on a birth certificate and a single photograph his mother kept in a drawer and never looked at. Vincent was smart, the kind of smart that got him into Central High School, the kind of smart that got him a scholarship to Temple University, the kind of smart that should have meant something, should have carried him out of that neighborhood and into the version of his life where intelligence and effort were rewarded with security and respect. He studied engineering. He graduated with honors. He got a job at a firm that designed water treatment systems, married a woman named Denise, who taught elementary school, had a daughter named Shayna, who had his eyes and his wife's smile, and a laugh that could break your heart with its unself-conscious joy. For 11 years, he had the life he was supposed to have. He had the job, the family, the small house in a decent neighborhood, the savings account that grew slowly but steadily, the future that felt as solid as the bridges he helped design. Then the firm lost a major contract. Then the layoffs came. Then the job search that lasted 6 months, then 9, then a year. Then the savings account that stopped growing and started shrinking. Then the arguments with Denise, quiet at first, then louder, about money, about pride, about why he wouldn't take just any job, why he kept waiting for something in his field, something worthy of his degree, his intelligence, his years of work. Then the mortgage payments they couldn't make. Then the foreclosure. Then Denise's parents offering to take her and Shayna in, but not him. Not the man who couldn't provide, couldn't protect, couldn't do the one thing a husband and father was supposed to do. Then the drinking that started as a way to sleep and became the only thing that made the days bearable. Then the separation. Then the divorce. Then the supervised visits with Shayna that became monthly, then occasional, then stopped altogether when Denise remarried a man who owned a car dealership and who could give Shayna everything Vincent couldn't, including a father who showed up. Vincent was 47 years old when he lost his apartment, 48 when he started sleeping in his car, 49 when the car was impounded and he spent his first night in a shelter, 50 when he left Philadelphia entirely because every street corner held a ghost of the man he used to be. He drifted. He worked day labor when he could, slept in shelters when there was room, slept outside when there wasn't. He ended up in Millbrook because a truck driver gave him a ride, and because Millbrook was small enough that the police didn't sweep the homeless out of sight, but not so small that there was nowhere to disappear. He found a spot behind the library where the dumpster blocked the wind and where the security lights didn't quite reach. He learned the schedule of the soup kitchen at the Methodist church, the hours of the food bank, the names of the people who would hire him for a day to clean gutters or move furniture or rake leaves, and the names of the people who would call the police if he sat too long on a public bench. He learned to make himself small, quiet, invisible. He learned that most people looked through him rather than at him, so that he had become a category rather than a person, that homeless was not a condition he was experiencing, but an identity that erased everything he had been before. Harold and Margaret Hendricks walked past Vincent every Thursday for 2 years. Every Thursday, they drove into town from the house on Sycamore Avenue, parked in front of the bank, conducted their business, picked up groceries at the IGA, and walked to the diner on the corner of Main and Fifth for lunch. Every Thursday, Vincent sat on the bench outside the library with a backpack that held everything he owned and a paper cup for spare change that most people pretended not to see. The library was directly across from the diner. The bench was directly in their path. They walked past him 104 times, give or take, accounting for vacations and holidays and the week Harold had bronchitis. They never gave him money. They never asked his name. They never made eye contact. Margaret once said, quietly, as they crossed the street to avoid walking directly past him, that it was such a shame that people let themselves get that way, as if poverty and homelessness were choices made out of laziness or moral failure, rather than the result of 1,000 small disasters accumulating like snow until the weight became unbearable. Harold once said that giving money to people like that only enabled them, that there were shelters and programs and churches, that if they really wanted help, they could get it. We, as if the systems designed to catch the falling, were not themselves full of holes and bureaucracy and 1,000 humiliations designed to remind you that you were receiving charity and should be grateful for whatever scraps were offered. They were not cruel. They did not spit or curse or threaten. They simply erased Vincent from their field of vision, the way you erase a poster you've seen too many times or a building you pass every day without noticing its architecture. They felt virtuous for not being openly hostile. They felt they had nothing to apologize for. They had worked hard. They had earned what they had. The people who had not earned it were not their responsibility. This is what they believed. This is what they had always believed. On the third Thursday in October, Harold and Margaret finished their lunch at the diner. He split a slice of apple pie, left a 15% tip rounded up to the nearest dollar, and walked to their car, a 10-year-old Buick sedan that Harold maintained meticulously, oil changes every 3,000 miles, tire rotations twice a year, a vehicle he intended to drive until it, or he died, whichever came first. They did not notice the man watching them from across the street. They did not notice the second man sitting in a gray Honda Civic with a dented passenger door. They got in their car and drove home, east on Route 40, then north on Millbrook Road, then the long driveway that curved through trees whose leaves were just beginning to turn gold and red and orange. They did not notice the gray Civic following 3 cars behind. The men who robbed them were not professionals. One was 23 years old, the other 26, both with felony records, both with addictions that cost more per day than most people spend on groceries, both desperate in the way that makes people dangerous and stupid. They had been watching the bank, watching for elderly customers who came in regularly, who moved slowly, who drove nice cars and wore nice clothes and probably had cash and jewelry and PIN numbers they would give up quickly under pressure. They followed Harold and Margaret up the long driveway and waited until the car stopped in front of the garage. They moved fast. One grabbed Harold from behind as he was stepping out of the driver's seat, arm around his throat, voice in his ear saying, "Give me your wallet, give me your wallet, give me your fucking wallet." The other grabbed Margaret, yanked her purse from her shoulder so hard she fell to the gravel driveway, batch of gravel that tore through her stockings and into the soft skin of her knees and palms. Harold tried to fight. Harold was 73 years old and had not been in a physical confrontation since 9th grade when Billy Thatcher had punched him in the stomach during gym class, and Harold had punched back, and both of them had been suspended for a day. Harold's body did not remember how to fight. Harold's body was slow and stiff and bewildered. The man hit him in the face once, twice, then threw him to the ground. Margaret screamed. Margaret was told to shut up or they would kill her, and she believed them, and she shut up. The men took Harold's wallet, Margaret's purse, their phones, Harold's watch that had been his father's, Margaret's wedding ring that required twisting and pulling, and Margaret biting her own lip until it bled to keep from screaming again as the man wrenched it over her swollen knuckle. They took the keys to the house and went inside, while Harold and Margaret lay on the gravel driveway trying to breathe, trying to understand what was happening, trying to make sense of a world that had, in less than 3 minutes, become unrecognizable. The men came back out with a pillowcase full of Margaret's jewelry, Harold's coin collection, a box of silver dollars, 2 laptops, an iPad, anything small and valuable they could carry quickly. Then one of them said, "What do we do with them?" The other one said, "We can't leave them here. They'll call the cops the second we're gone." The first one said, "So what do we do?" They decided to take them. They decided to dump them somewhere far enough away that by the time the old people got home or got help, the 2 men would be 3 states away. They forced Harold and Margaret into the trunk of the Buick. The trunk was dark and smelled like oil and spare tire rubber and the faint synthetic floral scent of the emergency kit Margaret had bought at the drugstore and never used. They were inside that darkness for 43 minutes. Harold's leg was bent at an angle that sent bright wires of pain up his spine. Margaret's face was pressed against the carpet, and she could not get a full breath, and she thought, "This is it. This is how we die." And the thought was so enormous and so banal at the same time that she felt something close to laughter bubbling up in her chest, alongside the terror. The car stopped. The trunk opened. They were dragged out, but not gently, and found themselves on a dirt road surrounded by trees, the late afternoon sun slanting through branches and making shadows that looked like bars. One of the men said, "Start walking." They walked. Margaret's knees were bleeding through her torn stockings, and every step sent a spike of pain up her legs. Harold limped, his left leg barely supporting his weight, something wrong inside it, something torn or broken or dislocated. They walked for maybe 10 minutes, maybe 15, into the woods, off the dirt road, and onto a trail that was barely a trail, just a gap between trees. Then one of the men shoved Harold and he fell, and when he fell, he heard something in his leg snap, a sound like a branch breaking, and the pain was so total and so consuming that he vomited into the leaves. Margaret knelt beside him. One of the men stood over them. One of them said, "If you follow us, I'll fucking kill you, understand?" Margaret nodded. Harold could not speak. The men left. Their footsteps crashed through the underbrush, then faded, then disappeared entirely. The woods were silent, except for the birds and the wind in the high branches and Harold's ragged breathing. Margaret said, "Harold, we have to move. We have to get back to the road." Harold said, "I can't." Margaret said, "You have to." Harold said, "My leg is broken. Maggie, I can't put weight on it. I can't." Margaret was 71 years old and weighed 140 pounds and had not lifted anything heavier than a grocery bag in years. She could not carry her husband. She tried. She got her arms under his shoulders and tried to drag him, and made it perhaps 6 feet before her strength gave out and she fell backward into the dirt. Harold said, "Leave me." Margaret said, "Absolutely not." Harold said, "Go get help and come back." Margaret said, "I don't know where we are. I don't know which way the road is. I don't know how far we came." Harold said, "Maggie, please." Margaret said, "I'm not leaving you." They stayed. The sun set. The temperature dropped from 64 degrees to 41 degrees. They had no jackets. They had no water. They had no phones. They had nothing but each other, and the slow realization that no one knew where they were, that their children lived hundreds of miles away, that their neighbors were not the kind of neighbors who checked in daily, that it might be days before anyone noticed they were missing. Margaret tried to keep Harold warm. She lay next to him and pulled his body against hers and felt him shaking with pain and shock and cold. She prayed. Though she had not prayed seriously in years, not since Diane's surgery when Diane was 12, not since Kenneth's car accident when he was 17. Prayer as a thing you reached for in emergencies and forgot about when life was stable. She prayed now. She did not pray for rescue exactly. She prayed for morning. She prayed that Harold would survive the night. She prayed that whatever happened would happen quickly and without more pain. Harold drifted in and out of consciousness. In his lucid moments, he thought about the hardware store, about his father teaching him to read a tape measure, about Margaret in her wedding dress, about Kenneth's high school graduation, about Diane's first baby, each a grandson he had held in the hospital, and who was now 15 years old, and who Harold realized he barely knew, because Diane lived in Seattle, and visits were expensive and infrequent, and you could love someone and still allow years to pass without the effort required to close distance. He thought about the man on the bench outside the library. He did not know why he thought about him. The image simply appeared in his mind, a man with a weathered face and a backpack and a paper cup, a man Harold had walked past without seeing for 2 years. He wondered if the man was cold tonight. He wondered if the man had a blanket. He wondered why he was thinking about this when he was dying. Morning came. Harold was still alive. Margaret was still alive. They were desperately thirsty. Margaret's tongue felt swollen and rough. Sir Harold's lips were cracked and bleeding. The sun rose and the temperature rose, but not enough. They called for help. Their voices were weak and hoarse, and the woods swallowed the sound. No one came. The day passed in a slow agony of thirst and pain, and the particular despair that comes from realizing that you are invisible, even in your suffering. By the second night, Margaret was no longer sure she wanted to survive. By the second night, Harold had stopped speaking. Vincent had not seen Harold and Margaret on Thursday. He noticed the way you notice a gap in a routine you've been observing for years. He did not think much of it. People changed their schedules. People went on trips. People stopped coming to town. On Friday, he noticed again. On Saturday, he wondered. On Sunday, he asked the woman who ran the soup kitchen if she had seen the older couple who usually came into town on Thursdays, and the woman said she didn't know who he was talking about, and Vincent realized he had no way to describe them except as the people who walked past him every week without looking at him. On Monday, Vincent did something he could not fully explain even to himself. He walked out to Millbrook Road. He did not know where Harold and Margaret lived, but he knew they drove in from the north, and he knew the kinds of houses people like that lived in. Houses set back from the road, houses with long driveways and old trees. He walked for 3 hours. He saw the Buick from the road, parked at an odd angle near the garage, the driver's door still open. He saw something on the gravel that looked like a stain. Yeah, he stood at the end of the driveway for a long time, knowing he should not be here, knowing that a man who looked like him standing at the end of a driveway like this was the kind of thing that got police called, that got questions asked, that got assumptions made. He walked up the driveway anyway. He saw the blood on the gravel. He saw the front door of the house slightly ajar. He called out. No one answered. He went inside. He should not have gone inside. He knew this. He went inside anyway because something was very wrong, and because 2 people who should have been here were not. The house had been ransacked. Drawers open, contents dumped, cushions thrown from the couch. Vincent backed out of the house and stood in the driveway trying to think. He looked at the Buick. He looked at the woods surrounding the property. He thought about the kinds of people who would rob an elderly couple and what those people might do to avoid being caught. He walked into the woods. He had no reason to think they were in the woods. He had no evidence, no trail, no logical justification. He simply could not leave. He walked for 20 minutes, looping through the trees in widening circles around the house. He found them in a ravine half a mile northeast of the driveway, found Margaret first, her body curled around Harold's, both of them so still he thought he was too late. He knelt beside them and put his hand on Margaret's shoulder, and she opened her eyes. She tried to scream. She had no voice left. The sound came out as a scraping whisper. Vincent said, "I'm not going to hurt you. I'm here to help." Margaret stared at him. Her mind was not working correctly. Her thoughts moved like cold honey. She knew his face. She could not remember from where. Vincent said, "Can you walk?" Margaret said, "I don't know." Vincent said, "We need to get you out of here. Can you try to stand?" Margaret tried. She got to her knees, then to her feet, swaying, leaning on Vincent's arm. She said, "My husband." Vincent looked at Harold. Harold was unconscious. Harold's left leg was bent wrong. Vincent was not a large man. He was 5 feet 10 inches and weighed maybe 160 pounds after 2 years of inconsistent meals and hard living. Harold was easily 190. Vincent got Harold onto his back. He did it the way he had learned in the army a lifetime ago, before college, before marriage, before everything. A fireman's carry that distributed the weight across his shoulders. He stood. His knees shook. He took a step, then another. Margaret followed. They moved through the woods at a pace that was less than a mile an hour, Vincent carrying Harold and stopping every few minutes to rest and adjust his grip, Margaret stumbling behind them, her hand on Vincent's shoulder for balance. They reached the house after 40 minutes. Vincent laid Harold on the porch. He went inside and found a phone and called 911. The ambulance arrived 17 minutes later. The paramedics loaded Harold onto a stretcher and started an IV and asked Margaret if she needed a stretcher too, and she said, "No, I can walk." One of the paramedics asked Vincent what happened, and Vincent said, "I found them in the woods. They'd been robbed, I think." The paramedic said, "Are you family?" And Vincent said, "No." The paramedic said, "Did you see who did this?" And Vincent said, "No." The paramedic looked at Vincent, at his worn clothes and his backpack, and the particular way a person looks when they have been outside for a long time. And Vincent could see the question forming, the suspicion, the reflexive association between homeless and dangerous. Margaret said, "He saved us." The paramedic looked at her. Margaret said, "This man saved our lives." The paramedic nodded slowly and wrote something on his clipboard and did not ask Vincent any more questions. At the hospital, Harold was taken into surgery for his leg. Margaret was treated for dehydration and exposure and the cuts on her knees and hands. A doctor asked her if she wanted to call anyone, and she gave him Diane's number in Seattle. Diane answered on the second ring. Margaret said, "There's been an incident." Diane said, "What kind of incident?" Margaret said, "Your father and I were robbed and we're in the hospital, but we're okay." Diane said, "I'm coming. I'm getting on a plane right now." Margaret said, "There's no need. We're fine." Diane said, "Mom, I'm coming." She was there the next morning. She was 48 years old, a software engineer, divorced, no children, a woman who had built a life 2,000 miles from Millbrook because Millbrook had felt like a place where nothing ever happened, and she had wanted a life where things happened. She walked into her mother's hospital room and saw her mother's face, the bruises, the cracked lips, the way her mother looked small and breakable in the hospital bed, and something in Diane's chest cracked open. She said, "Mom." Margaret started crying. She had not cried during the robbery. She had not cried in the woods. She had not cried during the rescue or the ambulance ride or the night in the hospital. She cried now, the way the creek ran after a heavy rain, fully, loudly, her voice filling the room. Diane held her. After a long time, Margaret pulled back and said, "There's someone you need to meet." Vincent had not left. He had spent the night in the hospital waiting room, dozing in a plastic chair, because he did not know if they would need him to answer questions, and because he had nowhere else to be, and because something in him needed to know they would be all right. In the morning, a nurse brought him coffee and a muffin from the cafeteria. She did not say anything, just set it on the chair next to him and walked away. He ate slowly, making it last. Diane found him there. She said, "Are you Vincent?" He said, "Yes." She said, "I'm Diane. I'm Margaret and Harold's daughter." She sat down next to him. She said, "They told me what you did." Vincent said, "I just found them." Diane said, "You carried my father a mile through the woods." Vincent said, "It wasn't a mile." Diane said, "You saved their lives." Vincent did not know what to say to that. He had spent 2 years being invisible, being nothing, and now this woman was looking at him like he was a hero, and he did not know how to hold the weight of being seen. Diane said, "Do you have somewhere to stay?" Vincent said, "I'm fine." Diane said, "That's not what I asked." Vincent said, "I have a spot." Diane said, "A spot." Vincent said, "Behind the library." Diane looked at him for a long moment. She said, "You're staying with us." Vincent said, "I appreciate it, but I don't need." Diane said, "I'm not asking." Vincent opened his mouth to argue, and Diane said, "My parents are alive because of you, and I don't know how to repay that, but the absolute least I can do is make sure you have a bed and food and whatever you need. So please don't argue with me, because I'm hanging on by a thread here, and I need to do something useful." Vincent closed his mouth. He nodded. Harold woke up from surgery groggy and confused. The doctors said the surgery had gone well, that the break was clean, that he would need physical therapy, but should recover fully. Harold asked for Margaret. They brought her to his room in a wheelchair, even though she insisted she could walk. Harold reached for her hand. She took it. They did not speak. They did not need to. In the silence, they were thinking the same thing, that they had come within hours of dying alone in the woods, so that everything they had spent their lives building, the house, the savings, the carefully maintained respectability, had meant nothing when it mattered, that they had been saved by a man they had spent 2 years pretending did not exist. The police came. They took statements. They found the Buick abandoned on a logging road 40 miles away, wiped clean of prints. They found Margaret's purse in a dumpster behind a gas station, with the cash and credit cards gone and everything else intact. They did not find the men. The detective said these kinds of cases were hard, that without witnesses or physical evidence, it was mostly just luck, that he would do everything he could, but he wanted to be realistic about the chances. Harold said he understood. The detective left. Harold said to Margaret, "Do you remember his face?" Margaret said, "The robber." Harold said, "The man who found us." Margaret said, "Of course I remember." Harold said, "I've seen him before." Margaret said, "So have I." They were quiet for a moment. Then Harold said, "The library." Margaret's breath caught. She said, "Oh my God." Harold said, "Every Thursday." Margaret said, "For how long?" Harold said, "Years." Margaret closed her eyes. She said, "We never." Harold said, "I know." Margaret said, "We walked right past him." Harold said, "I know." The weight of it settled over them like a blanket, heavy and smothering. The understanding that their lives had been saved by a man whose existence they had refused to acknowledge. The understanding that decency was not a matter of donations and politeness, but of seeing people, of acknowledging the humanity of those the world had discarded, of recognizing that the distance between a life like theirs and a life like Vincent's was not moral superiority, but pure dumb luck and a few bad breaks. Harold said, "I want to talk to him." Margaret said, "So do I." Vincent stayed with them. Diane had checked into a hotel, but Vincent she installed in her parents' house in the guest room that still had Kenneth's old twin bed and a dresser and a window that looked out over the backyard. She drove him there from the hospital and showed him the room and the bathroom and said, "Help yourself to anything in the kitchen." Vincent stood in the doorway holding his backpack and said, "I don't know what to say." Diane said, "You don't have to say anything." Vincent said, "This is too much." Diane said, "It's a bed." Vincent said, "It's more than a bed." Diane looked at him and her eyes were red, and she said, "My parents almost died, and you're the reason they didn't, so please just let me give you a bed." Vincent set his backpack down. That night, he took a shower that lasted 30 minutes, the hot water running over him until the small bathroom was thick with steam. He washed his clothes in the sink and hung them to dry. He found a pair of sweatpants and a t-shirt in the dresser, left over from Kenneth's high school years, and put them on. He slept in a bed for the first time in 8 months. He woke in the middle of the night, disoriented, having forgotten where he was, and when he remembered, he started to cry. Harold came home after 6 days. Margaret came home the same day. Diane had arranged for a hospital bed to be delivered to the living room because Harold could not manage stairs yet. She had stocked the kitchen. She had cleaned the house. She had put everything back in its place that the robbers had disturbed. When Harold and Margaret came through the front door and saw Vincent standing in the hallway, uncertain and clearly uncomfortable, there was a long moment of silence. Then Margaret walked to him and put her arms around him. She was not a physically affectionate person. She had hugged her children dutifully, but not often. She hugged Vincent like she was holding on to prevent a fall. She said, "Thank you." Her voice broke. She said, "Thank you, thank you, thank you." Vincent stood very still, his arms at his sides, not sure if he was allowed to hug back. Then he put his arms around her carefully, as if she might break. Harold could not walk well enough to cross the room. He said, "Vincent." Then Vincent looked at him over Margaret's shoulder. Harold said, "I don't have words." Vincent said, "You don't need words." Harold said, "I need you to understand." Vincent said, "I understand." Harold said, "No, you don't." Harold's voice was rough. Harold said, "We walked past you for 2 years and we never saw you, and that's on us, that's our failure, and you saved us anyway, and I don't know how to carry that." Vincent pulled back from Margaret. He said, "You don't have to carry anything." Harold said, "I do, though." Vincent said, "You were in trouble and I helped, that's all." Harold said, "It's not all." The room was very quiet. Harold said, "I want to do better." Margaret said, "So do I." Vincent did not know what to say to that. He had learned not to expect anything from people. He had learned that help was transactional, that kindness came with conditions, made that the world was divided into people who had and people who needed, and the two groups did not mix, except when the people who had felt briefly generous and the people who needed performed sufficient gratitude. He did not know what to do with this, with people who seemed to understand that they owed him something deeper than a thank you or a reward. Diane stayed for 2 weeks. In that time, she helped her parents heal, helped them navigate insurance claims and police reports and the process of replacing everything that had been stolen. She also watched Vincent. She watched the way he moved through the house like a guest who might be asked to leave at any moment. She watched the way he offered to help with everything, dishes, laundry, yard work, as if he needed to earn his place. She watched the way her parents watched him, and with a kind of awed gratitude that was painful to see. On her last night before flying back to Seattle, she sat at the kitchen table with her parents and said, "What's the plan?" Margaret said, "What do you mean?" Diane said, "With Vincent, what's the plan?" Harold and Margaret looked at each other. Diane said he can't stay in the guest room forever. Harold said, "Why not?" Diane blinked. She said, "What?" Margaret said, "There's a room over the garage." Harold said, "We've been using it for storage." Margaret said, "We could clear it out." Harold said, "Make it an apartment." Diane said, "You want Vincent to live here?" Margaret said, "If he wants to." Harold said, "We'd pay him." Diane said, "For what?" Harold said, "There's things I can't do anymore with this leg. Things that need doing around the property, maintenance, repairs." But Margaret said, "And I could use help with the garden." Diane looked at her parents like she was seeing them for the first time. She said, "You're serious?" Harold said, "Completely." Diane said, "Does Vincent know about this?" Margaret said, "Not yet." Diane said, "You should ask him." They asked him the next morning. Harold said, "We have a proposal." Vincent said, "Okay." Margaret said, "There's an apartment over the garage. It needs some work, but it's a good space. 2 rooms and a bathroom, and we'd like to offer it to you." Vincent said, "Offer it." Harold said, "To live in." Margaret said, "If you want." Harold said, "In exchange, you'd help us around the property. We can work out the details, but we'd pay you a fair wage." Vincent stared at them. He said, "You don't have to do this." Margaret said, "We know." Vincent said, "You don't owe me anything." Harold said, "We know that too." Vincent said, "Then why?" Harold said, "Because we want to." Margaret said, "Because we need the help." Harold said, "Because you're welcome here." Vincent's throat was tight. He said, "I don't know what to say." Margaret said, "Say yes." Vincent said yes. The apartment over the garage had been used for storage for 15 years. It was full of boxes, old furniture, things that had not been touched in a decade, but had not been thrown away, either because throwing things away felt wasteful and you never knew when you might need them. Vincent spent a week clearing it out with Diane's help before she left. They found a crib Kenneth had used, tax returns from 1987, a box of Margaret's mother's china wrapped in newspaper. They kept what mattered and donated or discarded the rest. They cleaned the floors, washed the windows, painted the walls a warm off-white. Diane bought a bed, a couch, a small table, and 2 chairs. She bought sheets and towels and dishes. She did not ask Vincent what he wanted. She just bought things that seemed right. And when Vincent protested, she said, "You saved my parents' lives. You're getting a couch." When she left to go back to Seattle, she hugged Vincent and said, "Take care of them." Vincent said, "I will." She said, "I mean it." Vincent said, "I know." She said, "And take care of yourself." Vincent nodded. She said, "I'm serious. You matter too." Vincent did not know what to say to that, so he just nodded again. Diane flew home and cried the entire flight, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming strangeness of discovering that your parents, who you thought you knew completely, were capable of change. Vincent moved into the apartment over the garage on a Tuesday in November. He had 14 possessions: his backpack, 2 changes of clothes, a water bottle, a flashlight, a pocket knife, a notebook he had been given at a shelter, 3 pens, a photograph of his daughter that was so worn the edges had gone soft, a receipt from the last meal he had bought for himself before the money ran out, and a small wooden bird he had carved from a stick during the long, empty hours of homelessness. He set these things on the dresser and looked around the apartment, at the bed with clean sheets, at the couch, at the window that looked out over the yard and the woods beyond, at the space that was his, and he sat down on the floor and put his head in his hands and sobbed. He worked for Harold and Margaret. He fixed the porch railing that had been loose for 3 years. He cleaned the gutters. He repaired the fence. When he helped Margaret rebuild the garden that had been neglected since Harold's father died, he was quiet and careful and competent. He did not talk much about his past, and they did not ask. Slowly, over weeks and then months, the apartment stopped feeling temporary. Slowly, Vincent stopped waiting for the moment when they would change their minds. Harold's leg healed. He did physical therapy twice a week and complained about it constantly and did every exercise exactly as prescribed. Margaret's knees healed. The bruises faded. The cuts became scars. They were different than they had been before. They noticed things now. They noticed the woman at the grocery store whose card was declined and they paid for her groceries. They noticed the man at the gas station asking for spare change and they gave him $20. Like they volunteered at the soup kitchen. They learned the names of the people they had spent years walking past. They were not saints. They were not transformed into perfect beings of pure compassion. They were simply people who had learned, too late and at great cost, that the world was full of invisible suffering, and that seeing it was a choice you made every day. Vincent reconnected with his daughter. It happened slowly. He found her on Facebook, sent a message he rewrote 17 times, waited 3 days for a response. She wrote back. She was 34 years old. She was married. She had 2 children. She was angry and hurt and cautious and willing to talk. They emailed. Then they talked on the phone. Then she agreed to visit. She came to Millbrook in the spring with her husband and her children, a boy and a girl, 7 and 5. But she met Harold and Margaret. She saw the apartment her father lived in. She saw the way he moved through the world now, sober, stable, still carrying the weight of everything that had happened, but no longer drowning under it. She said, "I'm glad you're okay." Vincent said, "I'm sorry." She said, "I know." Vincent said, "I missed so much." She said, "Yeah, you did." Vincent said, "I want to do better." She said, "Then do better." It was not forgiveness, not yet, maybe not ever. But it was something. It was a door left open. A year after the robbery, the police called. They had arrested 2 men in connection with a string of similar crimes across 3 states. They had found evidence linking them to Harold and Margaret's case. There would be a trial. Harold and Margaret would need to testify. The trial happened 14 months after the attack. Sir Harold and Margaret sat in the courtroom and looked at the 2 men who had beaten them and left them to die. The men looked smaller than they had in memory, younger, more pathetic. The defense attorney argued that his clients had addiction issues, that they needed treatment, not prison, that they were not violent people. Margaret listened to this and thought about the cold, about Harold's broken leg, about the 31 hours they had spent in the woods believing they would die. She thought violent is not the same as monstrous, and monstrous is not the same as irredeemable, but consequences matter, and actions have weight. The men were convicted. They were sentenced to 12 and 15 years, respectively. Harold and Margaret left the courtroom and went home. That night, they had dinner with Vincent. They ate at the kitchen table, the 3 of them. Some pasta and salad and bread Margaret had made that afternoon. They talked about the garden, about the porch Harold wanted to rebuild, about Shayna's upcoming visit. They did not talk about the trial. They did not need to. The robbery was part of their story now, but it was not the whole story. The whole story was this. Two people who had spent their lives believing they were good learned the difference between performative decency and actual kindness. A man who had been invisible learned that he mattered. A daughter learned that her parents were capable of growth. A family was built not from blood, but from choice and proximity, and the slow accumulation of meals shared and work done together, and the particular intimacy that comes from having survived something terrible. It was not a perfect ending. Harold's leg ached in cold weather. Margaret had nightmares sometimes. Vincent still flinched when police cars drove past. Shayna was still working through her anger and grief. The world was still full of people who walked past suffering without seeing it. But in this one small corner of the world, 3 people had learned to see each other. And that, Margaret thought, was something. That was enough. That was more than enough. Harold and Margaret Hendricks died within 6 months of each other. Harold at 81 from a stroke. Margaret at 79 from cancer. When Harold died, Vincent found Margaret in the garden, kneeling in the dirt, her hands buried in the soil. He sat next to her. She said, "I don't know how to do this." Vincent said, "One day at a time." She said, "That's not enough." Vincent said, "It's all there is." When Margaret got sick, Vincent took care of her. He drove her to appointments. He sat with her during chemotherapy. He held her hand when the doctor said there was nothing more they could do. Diane came home. Kenneth came home. Shayna came to visit with her children. The house filled with people who had been absent and were now present, drawn back by the woman who had taught them, late in her life, what it meant to truly see another person. Margaret died on a Tuesday in May. The funeral was large. People came from all over Millbrook, people whose lives Harold and Margaret had touched in the final years. People from the soup kitchen, people from the shelter, people who had been invisible and who they had learned to see. Vincent sat in the front row next to Diane and Kenneth. During the service, Diane stood and spoke about her mother. She is about the woman she had been and the woman she had become. She said my mother spent most of her life trying to be good, and the last part of her life learning what good actually meant. She said she was saved by a man she had ignored for years, and instead of being ashamed, she let that change her. She said, "I think that's the bravest thing a person can do, to admit they were wrong and to choose differently." After the service, people came to the house. They ate and shared stories. And slowly, as the afternoon faded into evening, they left. Diane and Kenneth and Vincent were the last ones there. They sat in the living room, exhausted. Diane said, "What happens now?" Kenneth said, "We'll need to sell the house." Diane said, "Yeah." They both looked at Vincent. Kenneth said, "You'll always have a place with us, you know that." Vincent said, "I know." Diane said, "We mean it." Vincent said, "I know you do." He looked around the room, at the house where he had lived for 8 years, where he had been given a second chance, where he had learned that the end of one life did not have to mean the end of all lives. He said, "I think I'll be okay." Diane said, "You sure?" Vincent said, "Yeah." He thought about the apartment over the garage that Diane had already told him he could stay in as long as he needed, rent-free, because the house would take months to sell. He thought about Shayna and the slow, careful relationship they had rebuilt. He thought about the men at the shelter where he now volunteered, the men who looked at him and saw someone who understood. He said, "I think I'll be okay." And he was. Not perfect, not healed in any final sense, but okay. He lived in the apartment for another year while the estate was settled. He found a job doing maintenance at the library where he had once sat on a bench, hoping for spare change. He moved into a small apartment in town. He saw Shayna and her children 3 or 4 times a year. He kept a photograph of her on his dresser next to the wooden bird. On Thursdays, he still walked past the bench outside the library. Sometimes someone was sitting there. When they were, Vincent stopped. He asked their name. He gave them money. He told them about the soup kitchen, the shelter, the church that gave out winter coats. He looked them in the eye. He saw them. And sometimes, not always, but sometimes, that made a difference.